Yes, good evening, Mr. Chair, members of the board. It was just yesterday that Dr. Calvin Bullock met with all of the principals and central office staff to give an update on the Office of Equity Affairs. And as soon as I got into the presentation, I believe that it was terrifically important that you hear his report also. And that he promised me that this is a 20-minute presentation, and he'll be available for questions afterwards. And I'm really quite pleased with the progress he's made in the short time that he's been in this position. Mr. Bullock, Dr. Bullock, I'm sorry.
Good evening.
Good evening.
All right, so I wanted to take this opportunity, and I'm appreciative of this opportunity to speak with you this evening and basically provide some updates on some of the work that I've been doing with equity since I started in this position in January. So basically this evening, first of all, I wanted to kind of review some of the evidence that supports the ongoing need to address issues of equity in DPS. Develop a general understanding of where we stand right now as far as the potential mission and vision of the Office of Equity Affairs. Review the preliminary goals that we've crafted, and when I say we, part of the process that I've undergone is arranging an equity advisory team composed of principals, central office leaders, parents, and community members, and also developing an understanding of the ongoing and upcoming equity initiatives and trainings we have going on. So, as I've been having conversations with community members, I've had the opportunity to speak with assistant principals and also members of the Superintendent's Teacher Advisory Council. I've been sharing that this work of equity is really rooted in data and issues that we see, disparities that we see in data. And a few months ago when I gave a presentation to the board, it was in the board packet, this chart that I'm projecting right now. And this is one of the more alarming data sets that motivates the work that I've been doing with equity affairs. So in this chart, you will see in the blue, the proficiency levels of our Black, Latino, and white students in Durham public schools. In the red, you see the 3rd through 8th grade EOG proficiency levels of North Carolina, of those same groups of students across the state. And what we see, first of all, I want to highlight just in Durham public schools, we often don't comment or speak about just how well our white students do, not just not as far as going over and above the state average, but actually over and above the state average for white students, which is the highest, one of the highest levels of achievement we have in the state. So our students, the already high levels that white students typically attain across the state, our white students are actually going above and beyond that. And that's not just on EOGs, but also on EOCs. But the inverse of that is also true, and that is what is alarming for equity affairs, and that is the fact that our Black and Latino students are actually not performing at the same levels of proficiency as Black and Latino students outside of Durham. So the work of equity affairs is really thinking about what can we do and what does the work look like to address the issues we're seeing with proficiency for Black and Latino students in particular. So some other data that fuels this work, and this is data, this data is specific to Durham, but this data is also pretty common across the state of North Carolina. So this is the reason why in Wake County Public Schools you have a similar conversation, why you have an assistant superintendent of equity affairs in Wake County, why you have an equity director in Chapel Hill Schools. Because typically when we're looking at short-term suspensions, there's a overrepresentation of Black students in particular in our short-term suspensions. And if you compare that to our student demographics, where our Black students make up 46% of our student population, you'll see that there shouldn't be an 81% representation of black students in short-term suspensions. So those are two of the main data sets that really fuel this work. Also, our graduation rates, we have seen some drastic increases in graduation rates across the board, particularly with our African-American students here in Durham. I think I was recently speaking with Dr. Lum. I think 9 years ago, those numbers were about 20% or 20% lower than they are now. And so there's been a great increase in the graduation rates for students of color in our district. So that is something to be celebrated. The challenge we see here is that the graduation rates for black males and Latino males in particular are a bit lower than their female counterparts. In DPS, our black females actually rival our white males as far as their graduation rate. So again, we see great things going on in some respects, but we also see some bigger issues for us to address. Now, in thinking about racial equity and why we've started conversations specifically around racial equity, we have some very unique dynamics, racial dynamics in Durham Public Schools. I've spoken with you before about amongst of the largest districts in the state, the 10 largest districts in the state, we do have the highest proportion of students of color by far amongst the largest districts. So, and the way that breaks down is 46% of our students are black and another almost 30% of our students are Latino. So over 75% of our students fall into one of those categories. And you have 18.5% of our students that are white. And also important to note, over 66% of our students qualify for free or reduced price lunch. You compare that with our teacher demographics, where 60% of our teachers are white, 35% of our teachers are black. The most stark contrast is really between our Latino or Latinx students versus our Latino or lack thereof of Latino teachers. And if we go a bit farther and look at principal demographics, this is a common trend also across the state, that there is a total absence of Latino principals in our district. So, and that, with that again being almost a third of our students, but a strong absence in our teacher and principal demographics, that is something that we really have to be mindful of in thinking about how we recruit and retain black and Latino teachers, and particularly thinking about Latino principals. So, and one of the reasons I bring this up and kind of in engaging people in these conversations around these different demographics is because if you look at our student population, which is composed primarily of students of color, and then we have primarily a white teaching staff, there can be some cultural dissonance often between teacher and student. But you also have the added dimension with us having almost over 71% of our principals being black principals. You can also have an interesting racial dynamic there between teacher and principal. And then thinking about principal versus, or thinking about principals and students, it's just different ways that race can play a part, and the biases that impact our relationships between races can play a part in what we're seeing here. So with racial equity, one of the foundations of this work that I'm working to address already in some of our schools is around issues of bias, and thinking about the different biases that we have, the different parts of our identities, and how those can serve as advantages in society or disadvantages. And when we're working with people who do not come from the same background that we do, how do we work through those differences? And how do we build relationships through those differences? So the current draft of the mission and vision of the Durham Public Schools Office of Equity Affairs is to ensure that students experience educational equity and grades pre-K through 12, regardless of race or ethnicity. The vision of this office is to establish this district as a national prototype for effectively educating students of color. One of the reasons, aside from just my personal experience working here in Durham Public Schools, but we continue to get feedback, whether it's advanced ed, we've had other organizations give us feedback, and they always talk about the potential of Durham Public Schools and the potential, particularly with us being in the city with so many resources. And so we're often told about different changes that can be made that could really produce some amazing and large gains and outcomes for our students. And so the vision of this work is that we can become a national prototype for how we educate students of color here. There are some amazing things going on, but what adjustments can we make to have even more amazing things and more widespread? So the core beliefs of this work, first of all, the first core belief is all students are capable of achieving academically. Healthy relationships are critical for student outcomes. And this is based on research. But again, thinking about the advanced ed accreditation feedback we received, one of the major findings that they had, or one of the major recommendations they gave us, was that all students be well known by at least one adult in each school. And so when we're talking about culturally responsive teaching, which is a conversation I've started having with a number of schools, the foundation of it is relationships. And again, with the different demographics we have, from student to teacher to administrator, we have to figure out how we work through cultural difference and build relationships, because ultimately that's what's going to help student outcomes. So initiatives that have shown some gains in relationships, or at least have some practices that have been helpful, like capturing kids' hearts, like the restorative justice opportunities we've learned about through Kozbach. The way that we can use those practices on a more widespread level can definitely research has shown that it will yield better student outcomes. Another core belief of this work in this office is that institutional biases have historically hindered the achievement of some groups of students. So I'm very upfront about that. Again, going back to bias and thinking about issues of bias, whether it's race, class, issues around sexual orientation, these biases have hindered the achievement of some groups of students. So we have to acknowledge that, and we have to think about what are we going to do to overcome those barriers. And we have to acknowledge those biases first, and then start to work through those so that we can have the highest expectations possible for all of our students. And finally, another core belief is that adjustments can be made that will significantly impact student achievement. And let me check my time. So, the current goals of Equity Affairs, there are 5 goals that I'm working on. The first, again, everything is rooted in data and analyzing data, and that is the foundation of the work. So I'm constantly looking at different data sets and finding data that shows some of the challenges we're facing, and also finding means for celebration. So when we're looking at graduation rates for Latino students, and we see that at Northern High School that they have the highest graduation rates for Latino students amongst comprehensive high schools, and we have a number of small high schools with 100% graduation rates. You know, talking to those schools and figuring out what are you doing specific or unique for this group of students that is yielding these outcomes. When we see that Hillside High School has the highest growth or constant growth, whether you're projected to be a level 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 in biology or math, biology or English too, for black males in that district, and all of those groups are growing across the board. What's being done there to cultivate that atmosphere where there is growth across the board? You know, so analyzing that data and then developing professional development that is supporting what we see in that data. Another goal, third goal, is about community partnerships. We recently, the first major event that the Office of Equity Affairs had was a community conversation on racial equity. This was co-sponsored with Village of Wisdom, which is a local organization that works with primarily with African American families and does programming around what they call protecting Black genius. And it's all about supporting African American students in schools and ensuring that their talents are being cultivated, acknowledged, and built upon in schools. So that was our first community conversation that took place on May 9th. Very well attended. We wanted a max of 60 people for this first conversation, and we did reach that maximum. And I thank board members who are also present for that. I'm currently in the works with El Centro, and we are planning to host a similar community conversation to connect with the families that they serve and to also get their feedback on what their racial equity concerns might be in our schools. So community partnerships, again, Advanced Ed, when they gave us our feedback, they spoke a lot about the need to connect and build stronger connections with families, with communities, and that is a major part of this equity work. Grant and research management, that is finding funding, additional funding to support this work is also vital, so that is a part of my work. And finally, communication. That is something that I've gotten feedback from the community conversations, first of all, and also from the equity team in thinking about, how do we build communication and share with the community exactly what we're doing in equity affairs and what the resources are to support students of color in the district. Very soon we will be having, our principals will have the opportunity to participate in the Racial Equity Institute groundwater training. And so what that does is provide a foundation of racial equity and how race is shown to be an indicator in various different systems through which we as humans interact. So whether it's healthcare, whether it's housing, whether it's education, race is a constant predictor of outcomes in those different systems. So the idea is to give principals a kind of grounding of this racial equity work. And from there, we will continue to build upon it. We already have a number of principals who have had the opportunity to do racial equity, the full phase 1 Racial Equity Institute training, and we have more that are signing up as time is going. So, and let's see, something else that I wanted to connect with and share. So when I'm working with schools and talking about healthy relationships and really knowing the kids, I share with schools that when I was coming out of college and I was 23 years old and I went to teach at Hillside High School and I was teaching a couple different classes and I was having the opportunity to connect with 16, 17, 18-year-olds. I didn't realize at the time that culturally I was just naturally connecting with some of my students. Being a Black male and teaching in a predominantly African-American school, there were certain cultural connections that I was unconscious of, but that were present. And I tell people now, being a little older, having different priorities and having kids of my own and just not having the mind of a 23-year-old anymore, I have to do some work to connect with 16-year-olds now, all right? So just because I'm an African American doesn't mean that there isn't a cultural distinction between myself and the young people that I work with. So I say that because we all have biases, we all have certain inclinations that we have to acknowledge and work through if we want to connect with our young people. And so that again, and that relationship and building that understanding of the students, because the thing is, once you know the students or once we know our students, then it becomes natural to build connections between what we're teaching and where they are, or where they are and what we need to communicate through the curriculum. But if we don't know the kids and we're still being hindered by the cultural barriers that exist between us and the kids, then we're never going to see the gains that we want to see, and we would not become the district that I know we will become, which is a prototype for effectively educating students of color and our white students. So that's my update on, what myself and others have been doing. Others, as far as, a number of people supporting this work, a number of people in schools who are very excited about what they can do to champion this work in their building. So that's where we are. If you have any questions or, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bullock. This is I am so glad that we have you here in Durham Public Schools. I mean, and Dr. Lum, thank you for introducing this, the equity group. What's the
Office of Equity
Office of
Affairs.
Equity
Yeah.
Affairs. I really appreciate that. I appreciate your work. I always hear about you're always gone. You're always going to do things, and I think this is exactly the direction, the path that we need here in Durham, really to understand ourselves and how our school system is effectively educating our students of color. I had a question about two of your graphs. It's the graduation rate and the proficiency level, the 3 to 8. So there's a little confusion. I know this is 3 to 8. This is grades 3 to 8.
Yes.
And it's a graduation rate.
Okay.
Right.
So what I did with this slide, and I actually could have and probably should have included the high school ELCs, but the trends are exactly the same as far as in 2016, the grade level proficiency for 3rd through 8th grade, and what we see as far as black students slightly having lower levels of proficiency than levels of black students across the state. It's the exact same trend in 2016 grade level ELC proficiency.
Right.
Also.
Does the proficiency level, how does the proficiency level affect the graduation rate? So like the graduation rate is high, it's a little closer to being equal, right? And the proficiency is very skewed.
Yeah.
Is there a connection there, or?
Well, essentially, with proficiency levels, especially in thinking about high school courses, so
Right.
you only have 3 ELC. So kids have 28 courses that they need to graduate. Only 3 of those courses have end of course tests,
Okay.
aside from North Carolina final exams.
Right.
And so there really is. I mean, that's just the grades that students are receiving on those 3 ELC courses versus their the larger scheme of their work, which leads towards graduation.
Okay. Okay, that makes sense. I
And
appreciate
one
it.
of the things we also think about with ELG or test proficiency, and particularly African American students, is what is called stereotype threat. And there are a number of students with test anxiety. Because of the stereotypes often associated with African American students in particular, and their ability on end of grade tests or high stakes exams, we see that because of that stereotype thread, there are often times where students, because of test anxiety, don't perform as well as they possibly could on those exams. So
Okay. Thank you. I appreciate
I
it.
like for us to think about the nature of high stakes testing and
Right.
the pressures that it can place on students.
Well, I surely appreciate you. I appreciate your work, and thank you for this presentation. That was great. Thank you.